Well, hello everyone. It's great to see so many of you at our first History Indoors talk of the year. It is the first talk of the year. That is an insane thing to think about. We meant to have one a few weeks ago. Obviously, it didn't happen. So Stephen is our first talk this year. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he's got to say about Saint Alban. I don't know much about it at all, so I'm looking forward to this, Stephen. 100%. But yeah, welcome everyone to History Indoors. If you don't know who we are, if you're new to the whole project, then what we do is that we provide free history talks every fortnight on so many different topics, ranging from ancient history all the way through to the modern period, which I think is great. We have such a collection of historical material, whether it's social histories, military histories, economic histories, buildings and places and spaces and all those kind of things. So if you don't know much about us, please do check us out on our website, and obviously check out our other videos, because we've got so many talks now. Stephen's given quite a few now, actually, haven't you, Stephen? You've given quite a number of them. I've given quite a few: Anglo-Dutch Wars, Civil Wars, and the like. And we've got plenty of material, so do check us out on there. But you're not here to listen to me randomly just spout on about everything. You're here to hear about who was Saint Alban. So let me introduce very quickly our speaker, who is Stephen Bishop. Now, Stephen has been with the History Tours project since the start. Very much important. He basically runs the YouTube channel pretty much, keeping it all tidy and works on all those kind of aspects, which I'm very grateful for. I kind of dip in occasionally, but he's a massive part of that. Massive story and done a lot of things. I mean, your research now, you've interviewed, haven't you, recently, Stephen, haven't you? So your PhD, that's, if I'm correct there.
Yeah, it's on pause at the moment.
It's on pause, exactly. That's the word to use. But you were looking at American Civil War and the statues relating to that, weren't you? Yeah. So that's his speciality. But instead, this time he's taking us a bit back into English history. So without further ado, Stephen, let me disappear for now, and I'll be back at the end where you can ask him questions and really grow him as a historian. So I'll be looking forward to that part, especially. But until then, I'll say bye, and Stephen, you can take it from here.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Michael. You might be wondering, what is a paused PhD student of controversial statues in the American Civil War talking about Saint Alban, who was from the Romano-British era? Well, and I must confirm, I'm not a classicist either. I'm not even a Latinist, although it is my New Year's resolution to learn Latin. So I do apologise if I pronounce things wrongly. You'll have to bear with me. However, how did I get into talking about this? Well, if you've been following History Indoors the past year, you may have attended some of my previous talks on the early medieval era. And I started it all almost a year ago now, with a talk on Lady Godiva. And that sort of led to a small series of talks on early medieval women. I had Emma of Normandy, and that video actually got to 1,000 views today, which was just lovely timing. So a little personal plug there. And then in November, I had a talk about St. Margaret of Scotland. You can access any of those talks and our other early medieval content by scanning that QR code that you can see on your screen there with the camera on your phone, and also by finding it on our YouTube channel. But that St. Margaret of Scotland talk sort of nicely segued and moved from my talks about early medieval women to early medieval and before saints. So here I am talking about Saint Alban today, who has been coined Britain's first saint and Britain's first Christian martyr. And part one of this talk is going to be about the concept of sainthood. What is a saint, and why am I talking about St. Alban? Well, to answer that second question first, I think in that St. Margaret of Scotland talk, I asked that question right at the end. Should St. Margaret be the patron saint of Scotland? And I wasn't really making an argument because I'm not Scottish, so it's not really fair of me to come down one side or the other. But I did pose the question that with Andrew being the long-standing saint of Scotland, but not somebody from Scotland itself, somebody from the Middle East, should a nativist, should a saint who was either born in the place or ended up living in the place, as Margaret did, actually born in Hungary, grew up in England, and then actually lived most of her life and her married life and her time as queen up in Scotland, actually is that a more suitable person to have as a patron saint? And that was done with the caveat that, you know, we are probably an increasingly secularized country in Britain. But if we're going to have that idea of a patron saint still, should it be somebody that's linked to the country? So, for example, Patrick is linked to Ireland, Saint David is linked to Wales, but we've got Saint George and Saint Andrew, who are Eastern European or Middle Eastern figures. And this kind of question was just, I don't think it was seriously posed by BBC Radio 4. I think it was just a little bit of fun, but they did some time ago a feature and a poll of people of who should be who should be the patron saint of England today. And those are the results that the poll received. St. Cuthbert in third, St. George in second, our current patron saint, and St. Alban first. So when thinking about segueing into talks about British saints, St. Alban had to be the first one that I started with. Well, how does one become a saint? Well, obviously saints relate a tie to Christianity, and the word in the Bible is used with a small s. I actually probably should have used it on that slide there where it says, how do you become a saint? Probably should have used it with a capital S there, because a small s saint in the Bible and the New Testament to refer to anybody who is a Christian, anyone who is a disciple of Jesus Christ. They are a saint. However, in time, the kind of institutionalized church has recognized saints with a capital S, noteworthy Christians. Now, if I asked you, how does one become a saint? How do you become a saint? Your answers probably would be different to everybody else's, but maybe the first thing that you would say is miracles. There we go. There's my camera. Miracles. If you are believed to have performed a miracle, then that is a one-way ticket to sainthood. The second one that you might have said is martyrdom. If you are martyred for your Christian faith, if you die specifically because of your Christian beliefs, then that is also another ticket to sainthood. However, Janina Ramirez has written a very, very good book called The Private Lives of the Saints. And we're going to have a little image of this on the final slide. So if you'd like to read it yourself, that you can write down the details and have a look at it up. And if you're from Suffolk, I'm just about to put it back into Suffolk Library, so it'll be in circulation again from tomorrow. But she makes the claim that actually, especially in the early medieval period, so it's the period of time that we've kind of more formally or usually in the United Kingdom call the Anglo-Saxon era, saints could be made for a wide variety of reasons, not just miracles and not just martyrdom. And she makes the argument that actually they were pretty much anybody who, and with bearing in mind that during the kind of middle to later Anglo-Saxon period, it's probably a given that people born in England are Christians. And I say born in England because obviously there's large-scale Scandinavian invasion and settlement, which I've explored in some of my other talks, that at first would not have been Christians. But those born in England, we assume that they're Christians. However, if they had wide-ranging popular renown, if they were revered by people, they were known to be very, very good, prominent citizens, or subjects, as I should say, and when they died, they have just universal respect by more or less everybody in the country, there's a good chance that they're going to become a saint. And even though Janina Ramirez didn't I don't think she made this point, it made me think of kind of our secularized version of sainthood is probably in Britain, the concept of knighthoods. You know, when somebody becomes a sir or a dame, that's probably our secularized notion of sainthood. Somebody who is widely regarded as having done something good for the community and revered. And it made me think, and again, I'm not sure these were necessarily Janina Ramirez's examples, but it made me think of people like Princess Diana and Queen Elizabeth II. By early medieval standards of what it takes to canonize somebody, to make them a saint, Elizabeth II would absolutely have become a saint. Not only was she a Christian, but we saw on her passing last year this huge veneration of her life, people flocking en masse to pay respects and tributes to her. And to a certain respect, Princess Diana may also fit that criteria. Somebody with universal, maybe love or affection is probably the better term, and widespread veneration almost at her death. So just to get in your minds, actually, the concept in the early medieval period of what it means to be a saint, what it took for somebody to be classed a saint with a large S rather than the small s that I've just put there, was quite wide ranging. And this is why when you look at maybe saints like Dunstan, for example, of the 10th century, their lives don't look particularly overtly Christian. You know, Dunstan does a lot of things politically and militarily almost, but not overwhelmingly Christian. He's, but because of the popular renown, wide range respect, these figures did become saints. And what I really wanted to do, and I wanted to do this in the last talk, and then I thought, this talk would probably be the best one to look at it. I wanted it to be able to come to this talk and give you a figure. Probably one of the first things you have in your mind is, well, how many saints are there? How many saints are there in Britain? How many saints are there across the world? And I'm really sorry to disappoint you, but at the moment, I have not been able to find a concrete figure. And that's because for many Western and Eastern European nations, and then other nations who have Christian heritage across the world, these countries may canonize people, recognize them as saints in their masses. And one way just to look at this and to demonstrate this in a pictorial way, just to sort of show you that, is how many places are there across Europe with the name saint in them. So you can see there the British Isles, that actually in comparison to large parts of Western Europe, so France and Spain and Portugal, we have fairly low numbers of places that are named after saints. The ones that spring to mind in my head, Saint Albans, which is what I'll be talking about today, Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, where I live, and then you might think of St Ives, St Neots, depending where you live in the country. I grew up in Hastings, and I was near St Leonard's on Sea, so St Leonard. But actually, apart from, you can see kind of a heavy condensation in Cornwall, to the southwest of Britain, actually our numbers are relatively low when you think of all the place names in France, and then also in Spain and Portugal that are that have the name saint, the word saint in their name. So that's just a nice visual depiction of, actually, there are tens of thousands probably of saints out there, not just in Europe, but who have been recognized in other countries with a Christian heritage. Now, when we come to look at Alban's life, we need to situate it in the historical context in which he lived. And to do that, we need to look at Roman Britain. Now, this is just a map just to cast your mind to the Roman Empire. And we're looking at 2,000 years ago. What did the Roman Empire look like? And what did the Roman Empire look like at its height? Now, I think this is really helpful to look at. And I've mentioned this before on talks as sort of my semi-disdain our history curriculum in the United Kingdom is basically starts at 1066 for our secondary school pupils, when standalone history lessons begin, which is at secondary school, because in primary school there are standalone history lessons, but they kind of merge into other lines of inquiry. But those standalone history lessons that usually begin in year 7 when a student in England turns 11, with 11 years old. It starts roughly with 1066 and then goes forward, and then by the end of year 9 usually reaches our present day, or the last 50 to 100 years. Now, I've lamented that the Anglo-Saxon period, or the early medieval period, if you prefer to call it that, gets lost. The Roman Empire doesn't get lost. Ancient Rome and ancient Greece fall under that remit of what we call in the UK classics, or Latin. However, the only problem with that is that not all schools teach that subject, and even within schools that teach that subject, not all students will study it. So all students will study history, not all students will study classics. So I can't assume prior knowledge of the Roman Empire, but I don't think the knowledge of the Roman Empire is as dimly lit as the knowledge of the Anglo-Saxon or early medieval period. But here we go. Here's the Roman Empire at its height, stretching from in the east through to the modern day Middle East, through Turkey and to Middle Eastern countries. In the south, as far south as North Africa, then as far west as present day Spain and Portugal, and then as far northwest as Britain. And looking at Britain, Julius Caesar sets foot in Britain. His men reach Britain in the 50 BCs. However, it was even though it was a serious expedition, it was a show of might by Julius Caesar to show what he could do. He could not only go to the far reaches of Western Europe, the Western European continental mainland, but he could also cross the sea into Britain. But the long-term settlement of Britain really happens under Emperor Claudius in AD 43. Now, if we think about this in terms of our world history, the year 0 is classically when we've considered Jesus Christ to be born, and it's kind of believed that Jesus died in the AD 30s, the early AD 30s. So around 10 years later, Claudius invades Britain. And this could have been at the invitation of various tribes in Britain. And it's a really interesting thing when you think about colonization. And sometimes you look at the history of colonization. I know I used to do this in looking at when I did my American Studies degree, and I was looking at North American history. And you just think, if the native tribes had all clubbed together, surely they would have been able to repel the invading colonial forces. And then you forget that actually tribes are not united. Tribes have differences and complexities, and this is the same in this era. The British tribes at the time, and especially those in southeast Britain, so the Catevallanis, the Trinovantes, the Iceni, my apologies if I butchered any of those pronunciations, they don't all sit to arm. And Claudius comes over and invades. And he goes up the Thames and then east all the way till he reaches Camulodunum, which is modern day Colchester. And he seizes that as a very important settlement. And that is why Colchester today markets itself as Britain's first city. And it eventually becomes Colonia Victricensis, the city of victory. Now, not too long after, a couple of decades after this, the Romans have extended their rule over Britain. However, they do it through not only through direct rule, but also through client kings, client leaders of tribes who they can get on side and who will do their bidding. And if you've watched recently the Netflix show Barbarians. I'm not saying that it's completely historically accurate, but this German language show showing the Roman invasion of present day Germany, basically, looks at this concept of client kings, those leaders of tribes who are not sympathetic to the Romans, but will do business with them, and those leaders of tribes that won't. And the husband of Boudica is one of these client rulers with the Iceni people. So Boudica, who you probably would have heard of, a very notorious figure in British history, also known as Boadicea, was from the Iceni tribe in present-day Norfolk, and her husband was a client king or client leader of the Romans. But when he dies, Boudica and the daughters are reportedly mistreated by the Romans, and this causes Boudica and the tribe to invade southwards and basically enact their revenge on the Romans, burning down Camulodunum, present-day Colchester, marching to London, destroying that, up to Verulamium, which is present-day Saint Albans, or just right next door to present-day Saint Albans, and destroying that as well. So the three major settlements in early Roman Britain, all destroyed. Now, Boudica was eventually stopped and reportedly took her own life somewhere around the Midlands. I don't know for sure, but somewhere around the Midlands. But it sets the Roman project back in Britain. Obviously, these buildings that they'd begun to create, and we have to, if you have an image of Roman rule, basilicas, temples, theatres, whatever they had built by this time is destroyed, and they need to be rebuilt. And that's where we get to Verulamium. Apologies if that picture on the right-hand side there is black for you. It's black for me, but I'm not sure if that's black for you. But if it is, my apologies. But Verulamium is next to present-day St. Albans. And we want to just get a picture or an idea in our heads of what Verulamium would have looked like in Alban's lifetime. So Verulamium, one of the most important cities, or one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire had in Britain three sort of categories of cities. It had at the top the Roman Colonia, and this is sort of the most prestigious city, full of Roman citizens, ex-veteran soldiers. Colchester was one of these, Colonia Victricensis. Lincoln was one of these, and that's why it's got that coal still in that from the Colonia, I believe. And then the next rung down is the Municipium, and St. Albans, or Verulamium as it was back then, was the only municipium that we believe was in Roman Britain at the time. Now, it was a rung down from the Colonia. You weren't automatically a Roman citizen, but magistrates who helped govern the cities, they would become Roman citizens, or could become Roman citizens at the end of their tenure. And then we had a third category, which most of the towns in England belonged to. Now, what was so good about becoming a Roman citizen? Well, you had certain rights. In some places of the empire, that would enable you to vote. You also had the right to be tried in Rome, and this becomes really important if you ever read the New Testament in the Bible, the Apostle Paul requests this. He was a Roman, originally Jewish man who then converts to Christianity, and when he's before the courts for having riled up some local groups through spreading the Christian gospel, he appeals to Caesar. He appeals to the emperor so that he can then go and be tried in Rome. And that's one of the important things that Roman citizens could ask for. Now, Albans Verulamium, it would have had a theatre, and this is the incredible remains that you can visit today of the Roman theatre at Verulamium. Now, from this vantage point, there's a picture of my own. You've got those raised bits going around the side where the audience would have been watching the entertainment. You can see that column, that just one surviving column in the background. That's just by the stage. You've also got a raised level there in the middle, showing where the stage would have been. Now, they actually believe that theatre may have also sort of doubled up as a mini amphitheatre as well, and there could have been some gladiatorial contests there as well. But in Verulamium, there would have also been a temple where sacrifices to the Roman gods would have happened. And Verulamium is one of the only places in Britain that has additional fortifications made on its city walls or town walls in each of the centuries of Roman rule, leading into the final century of Roman rule. Now, this could have been for various reasons. It could have been that it was particularly important and could have been liable to attack. But it could have also been for prestige as well, to make the walls seem grander. Now, I would just say at this point, if you ever get the chance to go to St Albans, go to the Verulamium Museum. It has some incredible finds from the Roman period that they have excavated, including the most incredible mosaics as well. And I was toying about putting some pictures of those in this talk, but I thought I'm just doing that just to do it. But do absolutely go to Verulamium Museum if you end up going to St Albans. So now we reach part 3, Christianity and the Roman Empire. Now, like I mentioned, when we situated ourselves in world history, our world timeline has centered around the birth of Jesus in, typically the year 0, and his death in the early AD 30s. Now, Christians are regarded by the Roman Empire as this very weird sect. And I think this is a wonderful thing, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. You can read the biblical accounts, the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, and the letters from the early Christians like Peter and Paul and James. And you can read what life was like as an early Christian from their perspective. And then on the other hand, you have those non-Christian accounts of the surrounding Roman world, their perception of Christians. So you have the accounts of the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, and you also have the accounts of very renowned authors and writers and thinkers at the time, like Pliny the Younger. And I would definitely encourage anybody to purchase the letters of the younger Pliny, because he writes towards sort of the straddling of the 1st century into the 2nd century. And he writes to the Emperor Trajan about this weird and what he calls a degenerate cult of people calling themselves Christians. And from what he can see, their really only crime which gets them in trouble is that they stir up the surrounding people at the time. They irritate and anger them. And if you read the Christian accounts, you get this, a letter like the book of Acts in the New Testament. You get this impression as well. Christians aren't a threat to the Roman Empire in terms of they're unlikely to damage property. They're unlikely to burn a Roman temple to the ground. They're unlikely to cause violence themselves. However, the message that they spread is not only likely to do a few things. It's likely to amuse the surrounding people, and this is what Pliny says. He says, from what I can see of the Christians, they meet together and have food, just plain food together, and they renounce things like theft and robbery and other vices. But also, the biggest threat that they pose to the Roman Empire is that they won't worship Roman gods and the emperor. And this is what they become persecuted for. And reading a letter, one of Pliny's letters to the Emperor Trajan, he says, Emperor, there have been pamphlets going around naming certain people as Christians. And what I've been doing is when these Christians, these people being accused of being Christians, come to me, I say to them, are you a Christian, and do you renounce being a Christian? And if they do renounce it, then basically they're free to go. However, if they don't renounce it, then I will force them to offer sacrifices to the gods and to the emperor, because emperor worship throughout the first century had developed as a thing. In Colchester, they'd so at the time Colonia Victricensis, they'd erected a temple to Claudius, that emperor who had invaded Britain. He has a temple dedicated to him for people to worship Claudius. He was deified as an emperor god, and this is a concept that continues throughout the first century. And if these Christians refuse to offer sacrifices to the gods and worship the emperor, then they are executed. And Trajan basically agrees with what Pliny is doing, but he just has this caveat: do not actively hunt them out. Do not actively hunt Christians out. And he discourages the culture of people producing pamphlets accusing people of being Christians. And it almost reads like the witch trials of the 17th century. Trajan basically warning, do not let this become a hysterical thing where neighbor accuses neighbor of being a Christian or once being a Christian. If a Christian causes trouble in your community and you can't avoid it, then deal with them in that way. If they refuse to sacrifice to the gods and to the emperor, then execute them. But otherwise, don't go actively hunting them out. But different emperors at different times during the Roman Empire deal with Christians in different ways. And certain emperors are more vociferous in their punishment of Christians than others. For example, the Emperor Nero, after the Great Fire in Rome, he persecutes Christians and blames them for the fire. And many Christians are executed under Nero's reign. And this is an image on here, just a drawing of Christians before, unfortunately, meeting their death. Other early prominent Christians, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement, they become early martyrs of the church. So if we think that traditionally Stephen is regarded as the first Christian martyr, the first person in the book of Acts to die for refusing to reject Jesus Christ. But then sort of the second and third generations of Christians, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement, disciples of the disciples or disciples of the apostles, they also are prepared to die for their faith. And then I just wanted to, there are numerous accounts of Christian martyrdom across the Roman Empire, but I just wanted to highlight this particularly heartbreaking and noteworthy martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity. And again, if I'm pronouncing Perpetua's name wrong now, I do apologize. But these were two very young women, early 20s maximum, who lived in modern day Tunisia at Carthage. And Perpetua, I believe, had an infant son, and Felicity was pregnant. And they had become recent converts of Christianity against the wishes of their family, and they were eventually executed for being Christians. And there is a written account of that they wrote themselves before they died. I think it was written by Perpetua, detailing their conversion and then the moments leading up to their death, which would be well worth a read. I haven't read it myself, but it would be well worth a read. But these are two female Christians, not just males. It's not just men who are subject to execution, but females, Perpetua and Felicity, who are also martyred for being Christians. Here's the fourth part then. We've reached Alban. We've gone through the centuries, and now we reach this figure of Alban. Who was he? Well, we don't know specifically when he lived. We think that he lived at some point either throughout the 3rd century or the very beginning of the 4th century. Now, not even St. Alban's Cathedral can seem to agree on this. There's some murals or parts of the cathedral will say that he lived in I think it was AD 204 they had, or the date in the 200s. But then you'll buy a book from the bookshop and it will have a later date of the early 300s. And this is because much of what we know about Alban's life comes in a detailed account by Bede. who lived or who died in the 8th century. So, and the way Bede frames his account, not every single account in Bede's ecclesiastical history of the British people, which is basically a massive history of the history of Britain, but also of the Roman Empire and then how that influences British history. It's not all in chronological order. And what happens just before his account of Alban is he talks about the reign of Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century, towards the end of the 3rd century, and his persecution of Christians. And then he says, under such emperors or under these emperors lived Alban. So there's not a specific linking to Diocletian, and therefore there are a couple of proposed dates. But we believe that he lived any time in Britain throughout the 3rd century. And Alban was a Roman citizen, Romano-British person, and he sheltered a Christian priest who later became known as Amphibolus, if I'm pronouncing that right. And again, I apologize if I'm not. And Amphibolus was a Christian priest. Now, when Alban lived under a time of quite severe Christian persecution, and we know this because the account says that the Romans came looking for Amphibolus the priest. Now, whilst Alban harboured him, he wasn't originally a Christian, but what Alban comes to do is to become converted by Amphibolus. He is converted by him and becomes a Christian whilst he is in his house. And when the authorities come for Amphibolus, Alban puts himself in the way, essentially, and offers himself to be taken instead of Amphibolus. And this obviously angers the Roman authorities. And when they ask him about who he is, Alban replies that he is a Christian following Christian rites. And he has this quote here: "My parents named me Alban, and I worship and adore the living and true God who created all things." He refuses to renounce his faith. He refuses to worship the Roman gods, and therefore, during this period of Christian persecution, the result is death and execution. But the real story and what enables him to be a saint, not just because of his martyrdom, but because of miracles as well, is that when Alban is being led to his execution, he comes to a river, and the river dries up, allowing Alban to cross. And Bede's account says that one of the executioners basically converts to Christianity on the spot and refuses to take any part in the execution because of the miracle that he's seen. And he also is executed, I believe, as well. And then the account talks about Alban going up 500 paces up this hill, which has now been recognised as Holywell Hill, and we'll see why that's important soon. And on his way up there, a spring bubbles from the ground, giving Alban refreshment. And Bede says this is proof to those surrounding him that basically the river drying up was an act of God, and that through God, Alban can control the waters. Alban is decapitated. He is executed. Amphibolus is also executed. And therefore, Alban becomes Britain's first martyr. Now, Alban's not the only martyr during the Romano-British period. Aaron and Julius become martyrs as well for the Christian faith, and Bede records that they lived in the city of Legions, which has been broadly identified as Caerleon. I probably pronounced that really wrong, in Wales, and there's this wonderful amphitheatre that has been excavated in that place as well. And Aaron and Julius were also Romano-British martyrs as well, just after Alban. Again, if that's come up black on your screen, that top right picture, I do apologise. I was hoping to show you what Caerleon would have looked like back in the Romano-British period, but I'll just talk to you about the book that was from, because it's a really, really good book to read. But I'll mention that at the end. So for Christianity, what happens? We've got in Britain. Well, After intense persecution, Emperor Constantine becomes the Emperor of Rome. Now, for those of you who are from Colchester or our Essex-based audience, you may know that Constantine, his mother is Saint Helena of Constantinople, and Saint Helena has got this long-standing link with Colchester. The Colchester arms relate to Saint Helena. There's a statue of her on top of the town hall as well, I believe. So there's this long-standing link between Saint Helena and Constantine, and I love when those little links are made. Anyway, Constantine becomes, for lack of a better word, quite intrigued and enamored with Christianity. And he issues the Edict of Milan in AD 313, which basically preaches tolerance to Christians, that they are allowed to worship. Now, Constantine, most likely, most historians agree, became a Christian later in life. He surrounds himself with more and more Christians in his court, and eventually converts to Christianity. And then in the subsequent decades, not only is Christianity tolerated, but it becomes the preferred religion of Rome. And this obviously is a massive upheaval in Roman life. And many historians, up until the last couple of decades, have attributed the fall of Rome. So the fall of Roman rule in Britain is usually attributed to the year 410, or maybe a couple of years before that. And though Roman rule in the Eastern Roman Empire, with the seat of Constantinople, continues for many centuries on, the Western Empire, the Western Roman Empire, falls. And many historians have traditionally attributed that to the rise of Christianity. Some of the invading forces into Rome were Christians. Alaric claimed to be a Christian, who was one of the prime invaders of the Roman Empire. But also there's this cultural decline of everything that made the Roman Empire Roman. So the gods, the temples, and not even just the temples that had to be either repurposed for Christian worship or torn down because of their worship of pagan gods in Christians' eyes, but also the disuse of theatres and amphitheatres. So if you ever go to the Verulamium theatre in St Albans, they believe that the theatre went in decline after Christianity became tolerated and more and more people became Christians, because things like gladiatorial contests would have been an anathema to Bible-believing Christians due to their violence. So lots of cultural changes happen in the Roman Empire because of Christianity. Now, in recent decades, other reasons have been proposed for the fall of the Roman Empire, or at least the Western Roman Empire, that are not just down to Christianity. But it is, even if it's not the sole reason, it being a really huge contributing factor just shows how important that watershed moment of the Edict of Milan is. And for Alban, if the later date of his martyrdom is to be taken in the year AD 304, I think has been proposed by historians, then he was only just about a decade away from not having to die for his faith. And we move on to the fifth and final part, Albans Legacy. Well, like I said, Bede's account is the preeminent account of his life, but historians believe that was built on perhaps the works of Germanus. I've actually spelt that incorrectly there. I do apologise. There should be an N between the A and the U. But Germanus was also became a saint, but he was a bishop from modern day France, and he came over to Britain, and in the sort of post-Roman period, in this sort of almost abyss in the historical record, not quite an abyss, but this separation between the end of Roman rule in AD 410 roughly, and then the sort of the period that we can really call the Anglo-Saxon era, that we're kind of looking at the end of the 500s into the beginning of the 7th century and the 600s. What happens in that, I think they call it the sub-Roman period in Britain, what happens in that intermediary period? And this is where we get the sort of hazy mythological legendary figure of King Arthur, for example. And we also have the writings of Gildas, a sort of historian who writes about that period. But Germanus comes over and he fights a Pelagian heresy, which is this massive Christian controversy of a man called Pelagius, and he preaches that basically Christians and human beings can reach perfection. They're not incapable of reaching perfection, and this is a massive controversy in the Christian church. And in fighting that heresy, in his opinion, Germanus establishes the cult of Saint Alban, or is thought to have established the cult of Saint Alban. And the Passio Albani, which is not specifically attributed to Germanus, although it could have been, is a life of the Passion of Saint Alban, the martyrdom of Saint Alban. And this could be what Bede used to write his material about Saint Alban's life. And then King Offa of Mercia, during that early medieval Anglo-Saxon period, one of the most renowned kings of that era, a very important king of Mercia. And Offa builds on that cult of Saint Alban, that adherence, that veneration of Alban as a saint. And he helps the church at the site of the shrine of Saint Alban flourish. And there are images part of this series. I think this is a series by Matthew Paris of Offa visiting the shrine of Saint Alban. Now, the incredible thing is that you can visit the shrine of Saint Alban in Saint Alban's Cathedral today. Now, I mentioned Holywell Hill. Now, what happened? You might be thinking, what happened with Verulamium after 410? You said it was in decline. Well, what happens is the settlement moved away from Roman Verulamium up the hill, and the new settlement centers around the shrine and the church of St. Alban, where he was supposed to be martyred on Holywell Hill. And this is where St. Alban's Cathedral stands today. And from an architectural point of view, an absolutely incredible, very beautiful cathedral. And there's a quote there from Bede, which talks about the church being erected around the site of Alban's martyrdom. And you can visit the shrine today, and apparently there is the shoulder blade as well that has been reunited. So relics are a really important part of the cult of saints. And recently, in the last couple of decades, the St. Albans Cathedral was reunited with what is believed to be a shoulder blade of St. Alban. So there is a shrine still today in St. Albans Cathedral. That image is my own. You can go right up to it. There are prayers around the outside for it. And there is also a shrine of St. Amphibolus as well in St. Albans Cathedral that you can visit today. And then most recently, how has Alban been remembered? Well, these statues behind the altar have been erected recently of Christian martyrs, people who died for the Christian faith. I think these were erected in 2015. And they look at different figures from history, Alban being in the middle. There's also on the far right Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian martyr during World War II. But Alban is there, memorialized as in statue form behind the altar. And actually, if you go to St. Albans Cathedral during a service on a Sunday morning, those statues behind the altar really draw your eyes not only towards the front, but to Britain's first Christian martyr, St. Alban. There's also other ways that Alban has been remembered as well. And the flag of Mercia. So any of you watching here from the Midlands, you may be familiar with the flag of Mercia. There it is on the right-hand side, also on the coat of arms of St. Albans city itself. But this flag of Mercia, that humongous and, the most important of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at one point before the rise of Wessex. And the cross of St. Alban, that yellow cross, was laid on the flag, probably due to Offa's adherence to St. Alban and linking himself to that cult of St. Alban. And then my last question, and I posed it at the end of my St. Margaret of Scotland talk, and I'll pose it again here. Who should be patron saint of England? We've got a patron saint of England who was a Christian around not too dissimilar a time than Alban, but not from Britain, from modern day Turkey. Now we have, if we're going to have a patron saint of England, and that's obviously a conversation to have as we become, maybe people will argue, a more secularized country. Do we need a Christian patron saint of a country? But let's bear in mind, let's assume that patron saints are about to stay. Who should be the patron saint of England? Should it be George or should it be somebody else? Well, there is a strong case, just like in that BBC Radio 4 poll we looked at the beginning of the talk, that it could be Saint Alban. British, the first saint in Britain and Britain's first Christian martyr. But there's also other figures, and not just Cuthbert, who was in that poll. There is also Edmund, Saint Edmund the Martyr, and this is something that BBC Radio Suffolk tried to push a few years ago, for Edmund to be restored as the saint of England, because it's not always been George. Edmund at one time was revered as a patron saint, and also Saint Edward the Confessor as well. But Saint Edmund there, pierced with arrows, could he also be claimed as a patron saint of England? Well, that's going to be the theme of my next talk in mid to late June. So do keep your eyes peeled of that in History Indoors. But I think it's a really interesting question. And then I also thought, looking at the flag of Britain there, let's just take a hypothetical argument. If Scotland achieved independence, what would happen to our flag? Would we have to get rid of the blue of the Union Jack? Or perhaps you could just change that cross to yellow in memory of St. Alban. So that was just a little bit of fun that I was having in the top right-hand corner. But that's the end of the talk. And as I mentioned, I've mentioned a few books today in this talk, 3 of which are on there. Now, there was The Private Lives of Saints, the one that I mentioned at the beginning by Janina Ramirez. There are also the 2 books, Roman Colchester and Roman Caerlon. And I was hoping to be able to show you some wonderful images by the author who has visualized in graphic design what Roman Colchester and Roman Caerlon would have looked like. And he's planning to do one of Roman Verulamium as well. But I was just hoping to show you what those Roman cities would have looked like. So you could have got a flavor of what Verulamium would have looked like, but the pictures weren't working for me. But do check out those books, they're absolutely fantastic, and the author assures me that one about Verulamium should be coming soon. I'm sure Michael might mention as well towards the end of the talk, but there are 2 talks up there in the top right hand corner, one in 2 weeks time, and then another at the end of February. So if you'd like to sign up for those, do scan the QR code. But otherwise, please do like the video if you have enjoyed watching it, and please do ask questions in the chat box. But thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Stephen, for that. And as people have just been saying, thank you for the talk. Now, please do ask questions. You know, we love having questions thrown at us, and I love grilling Stephen specifically because it's quite fun to do so. So please ask really complex questions so we can just watch discussion take place, and for a bit of fun as well. Now, there's no questions just yet, so it gives me the power to ask the first kind of question there, Stephen. So you have to deal with this, and it goes really to what you said at the end about St. George and St. Alban. Is obviously St. George has become the patron saint of England, and obviously there's a whole reasons why that is, and there's a historical behind that. Obviously St. Alban was such an important figure though beforehand, as you've always mentioned. So why do you think St. Alban didn't get that position of kind of recognition? And the second part of that is, St. Alban today. Yes, we have St. Albans, but what is do you think our general knowledge and legacy of St. Albans in our contemporary world, do you think? So 2 very broad questions, and I know that obviously I'm quite difficult answer, but this is what I'm here for. This is why I pay the big bucks to.
If only we were paid the big bucks, right? No, really good question. So I don't know I don't think there's a definitive answer why certain saints are were maybe relegated, but why certain saints were preferred. I think it's all due to the monarchs at the time. So when I did some research on Saint Edmund, and obviously I'm going to be collating that into a talk in June, Saint Edmund and Saint Edward the Confessor were sort of two of England's most prominent saints in sort of the 12 and 1300s. But as time goes on, it depends what king or queen, which saint they attach themselves to. So we saw in the talk that King Offa of Mercia, he attaches himself to Saint Alban. It gives credence to the reign of the monarch, but it also gives credence to the saint. If there's royal patronage, and it's the same today, I guess, with the kind of royal hallmark, I guess, if royalty attach themselves to a certain brand today, or if we say a saint back then they achieve prominence. And it's, I think, and I'll clarify this in my St. Edmund talk, but it was really around the 16th century, at the time of the Reformation, where certain monarchs linked themselves to certain saints, but also removed that link to saints as well. And I think there's maybe our lack of knowledge of St. Alban, to dovetail into the second question, comes from that Reformation period. It's so interesting when you read about the lives of saints. So that Janina Ramirez book, she goes through so many saints in British history, and most of them, their cult is surrounding the physical remains of their body. So relics become a huge part of sainthood, and pilgrimages. People go on pilgrimage to visit the shrines of certain saints, so that they can visit the bones, and those relics, those bones of these saints, almost have extra kind of miraculous power, and that people go on pilgrimages. The Reformation happens under Henry VIII, and many of these relics are destroyed. Many of the shrines are destroyed, and that sort of mysticism around relics is not overnight, but through the physical removal of the remains. I think there's probably a detachment from saints and sainthood, and it doesn't go at all. And we obviously see the Church of England today. Most Church of England churches are named after saints, aren't they? You could think of maybe any village you live in England, and there is a Saint Whatnot's church, that is part of the Church of England. But I imagine maybe the decline of looking at saints in particular maybe happened during the Reformation, where there was more of a looking at a European-wide Reformation, looking at Luther and Martin Luther and John Calvin, probably less of a looking at saints with a capital S, and maybe focusing on the figure of Jesus as the centre of the Christian faith, and then all Christians being saints with a small s, rather than this veneration of particular people who were, saints with a capital S, sort of super Christians.
Yeah, I just jump in as well to that answer as well. Of course, as well, you get the idea of trying to preserve as well. I mean, especially in Cornwall, you get a rising up of people wanting to protect and defend the shrines and the saints as well. So again, someone that we know quite well said in a chat about the fact that Cornwall was called Land of the Saints. That comes back to that period as well, of defending the areas which they were sort of under threat. But also, the thing I want to mention as well, very briefly, as well, Reformation, also the Civil War. The Civil War there's a lot of destructions going on, of smashing stained glass windows and Civil War sites. So that's just to mention that. But yeah, really good answer. Thank you, Stephen. We do another question, which I'll ask, and I'm going to put it on the box so everyone can see it. So it says, excellent as always, which is a lovely comment. How do you think the inhabitants of sub-Roman Britain would have thought of themselves? As Britons, Romans, as a nation, or a distant colony? Big question. Very big question, actually.
Cracking question. Okay, so I know who that is. Thank you very much, Tim, for watching it and for that question. I think my first answer would be, for a definitive answer, it'd probably be most useful to read the writings of Gildas, so Gildas, who's sort of the writer of the time, and anything that Germanus would have written as well, because you could really probably get more of a feeling for the time written by a contemporary than anybody afterwards. It's a great question, because when you look at the studies of Roman Britain, there's a belief that even through to the 3rd and 4th century, so when Roman rule in Britain is very well established, that not everybody would have spoken Latin. Actually, official records would have been in Latin, and anything that was sort of government related to the towns and the cities and the province. But actually, the British languages, which had been there since before the Romans invaded, would have still been spoken by the inhabitants. And it does make you think that I was thinking about this when I was doing research on it. You think of a country like Iceland that have become that the language there of the Norse language there survived into Icelandic better than it did into Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. It was, and sort of one argument for that is that because they're so separate from the rest of mainland Scandinavia, they were less susceptible to influences from the continent, and therefore the language changes far less than it does in a country that has land borders. And I try to apply that. You try and apply that theory to Britain, and you think, okay, well, the Western Roman Empire falls, but there's no reason why it should fall in Britain in terms of, why can't they just continue doing things the way they did things? Why can't they keep that governance? Because they're actually, away from mainland Europe. However, I think because of the large-scale Roman evacuation of soldiers during sort of the Troubled period leading up to 410, they removed British soldiers from Britain to go and fight in Gaul, for example. So it leaves Britain undefended and removed of those Roman soldiers who sort of were the remnants of the Roman Empire. And maybe that's why, Roman rule collapses quite easily in Britain. Not everything collapses overnight, but I imagine there was probably, and how the period has been remembered, Romano-British with a hyphen, I imagine they probably saw themselves a bit like that, very much, some remnants of being Roman, but also retaining that British identity that had never quite been lost, because much of the population would have still spoken the native languages rather than Latin.
Yeah, I have to jump in as well, just as a story of nation making, because this is kind of like my thing. So I apologise. But also I think the idea of nation as well is quite new. So I think it'd been a people, it'd been a more of a identity, an ethnic identity rather than a national identity. People wouldn't have gone, I come from Britain as a nation. It would have been, I'm a Celt, or whatever it could be in that regard. So yeah, just as a thought there as well.
And also on that note, Michael, the one thing that maybe would galvanise the Romano-British people is the invasion from Gaul and other places, the Saxons. So when you read writings of the Saxons invading, and again, it's coloured by people like Bede who are Christians, but the Romano-British population would have been Christians. And then you've got the Saxons invading who are not Christians, and Christianity starts to decline because of that. So actually, if anything galvanized Romano-British people together into more of a common identity, it would have been repelling the Saxon invasions. But obviously, as we know from history, the Saxons sort of push the native British westwards
and north as well. So
northwards, yeah. So and then obviously Christianity declines for a couple of centuries until the missions of Augustine and others.
Of course. Which leads me to one more question. Please put your questions if you do want to ask a question, please do. But for me, there's one last question anyway. Is how much do you think how much of the story of St Alban do you think is true? How much do you think is being I don't know, not the word fabricated, but has been mythologized? So how much do you think is true? How much do you think isn't true? And what and why? So there we go. Have fun with that.
I think, and I always think this with history, that it's very hard to have any certainty around figures like this. And I think what happens is historians who are not Christians or not affiliated to, not sympathetic to religion, may look at a story like Albans and it's got involving a miracle and would say, well, that's obviously, fabricated or embellished by people like Bede who had a Christian agenda. And then there's sort of maybe a discarding of the story. Now, it's really helpful to have books like, popular books like Private Lives of Saints by Dr. Janina Ramirez, Ramirez, I think, if I'm right in saying, she probably wouldn't identify as a Christian today, but she's got Catholic heritage. So when you read the pages, it's not, you can tell that she's, you can see that. You can see that in the pages, and she's got more of a sympathy or an empathy for Christian writers at the time. Remind me of your question, Michael. I've gone on for the tangent.
Just how much do you think of the story of Albans true or not?
I think you've got to think in terms of oral history. Bede is writing about things that have clearly been passed down in history. Yeah. So this story of Saint Alban, whoever he was, and however much of his story, involves a miracle, for example, what we do know is that there's a good likelihood that he existed, because the story has been passed down through centuries, from the 3rd century to the 8th century when Bede's writing. So there must be this, in oral history, we probably don't pay enough credit to oral history in terms of, in societies that didn't have a literary heritage, that the transmission of stories through oral heritage. We think today that when we pass a story on, that very quickly it'll be Chinese whispers in it, and it changes. And you play that game sometimes at school, primary school, you say a message to your friend, you go all the way around, and the message is completely changed. But that's not an accurate retelling. Our society is very different. We write things down. Our short-term and long-term memory works very differently than hundreds of years ago. And you see that with in the 1800s, where 17 or 1800s, where the Brothers Grimm are collating German folklore tales, things that have been passed down through the centuries. So I would, whether you believe a miracle or not happened is probably how Bede's writing, what you consider a Bede, and probably B, whether you are a Christian or not, But what we could probably safely bet is he is a martyr. He died for the Christian faith, and we can probably use evidence of, well, he wasn't the only one. There's Aaron and Julius, and then the other examples across the Roman world, there were plenty of people dying for their faith. So there's no reason to put cynicism on Alban dying for his faith. You may put cynicism on the miracle, depending on your religious persuasion or just your, how biased you think Bede is or what he's trying to achieve there. But
and there's also the thing as well, isn't there? Just jumping in, there's also the thing as well when you take the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad, a prime example is that when Homer's writing, yes, some things perhaps have been embellished, and there's a lot of things which he puts his own slant on as he writes it. But the fact that the siege happened, we know is true. Yeah. So there's also sometimes it's just about finding, sometimes it's just about digging it, sometimes finding things correctly. But just one more question, because we are overrun. So I've got one more question for you, which comes in again for Tim, who's asked this question, which is, again, I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but I've got an answer for it, but I'll let you answer it first because it's your talk. Do you think the pagan idea of sacred objects, weapons, jewelry, influence the Christian idea of relics and a power of votive objects? That's a word, isn't it? That's a word, votive objects. So, last question, and a nice easy one for you, Stephen. There. So, do you think this idea carried on in Christian religion?
That's a cracking question. I often think, because I think we live in a time where sort of evangelical Christianity or Bible believing Christianity moves away from physical objects and relics. So whether that be, crosses, and obviously the Reformation was moved away from relics, didn't it? And moved away from physical objects of worship that people became very tied and attached to.
Yeah.
And at first, that's really understandable. And then that it would move, that people would move away from that. And then sort of recently, I've been kind of trying to be a bit more empathetic as to for people who became Christians back in Alban's time, back in the early medieval period, who weren't literate, who didn't have access to the Bible as we do today. There's so many versions of the Bible. It's, you can buy it in Waterstones. You don't even have to go to a Christian bookshop to buy it. Whereas back then, people wouldn't have easy access to scriptures. So I can understand why human nature might attach to places, so sites of pilgrimage, to relics, physical things that can make human beings feel close to be God or particular inspirational people, like someone like Alban would have been as an inspiration as a martyr. So I can just say from a human nature perspective why people may have been more attached to that. And maybe Tim's right in the sense that idea of sacred objects influences that. And I don't know if there's reverse influence as well. So I know when Tim and I went to an Anglo-Saxon Viking festival in Suffolk recently, and we're looking at some of the jewelry, and obviously the jewelry's been made today, but it is a replica jewelry, and there was a cross of Jesus that was worn by early Scandinavian converts to Christianity, during the early medieval period. So there's probably the reverse as well, that maybe pagan idea of sacred objects influenced Christian ideas of relics, and then vice versa. So there's some interplay. But so that's sort of my rambled answer to that question.
It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, it depends also your view on institutionalized religion and all these kind of things anyway, because there's a lot of things going on there. I've got my own answers for it, but I won't go into it because just for the time. But it certainly is an interesting thing to think about as well. I think it certainly is a link there as well, certainly to think about. And I think as well, just to kind of talk about that, to see that there are links between time periods. There's links between, like, the ancient period doesn't just stop and the medieval period just emerges. Like, there are these links, these carryovers throughout history. The medieval to the early modern period, the early modern to the modern period to wherever we are in now, which I have no idea what you call it now. Postmodernism, who knows? That's I don't get into that. But there are these links that go throughout the historical period, and that perhaps is one of those carryovers from one period to another period. Who knows? That's something to think about as well. But we'll end the kind of the questions here. We'll end the talk here. Just everyone, thank you for being here so much, for turning up and listening to our talk. Thank you, Stephen, for giving a talk and giving us just a really good insight and in-depth as well, like the context and into sort of things. It's such a great idea and helpful as well to help us understand the wider narrative as well at times. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for being here. We do have a talk in 2 weeks' time, which is about the House of Habsburg. This is going back into the 19th century. So we're jumping now into the modern period. So really interesting. We've got a guest speaker in for that as well. So looking forward to that as well completely. So do come. I expect that to be quite a busy talk. So please make sure that you're here, and we'd love to see you there too. So thanks everyone. Thank you, Stephen. And from History Indoors, thank you very much for being here. And we will see you very soon, I am sure. And I guess we should say Happy New Year, because it's the first time we see you. So Happy New Year, and we'll see you very soon. Bye for now.
Thanks all.